Hi, everyone. Good evening. Welcome back to round two of our Fellows Shop Talks, which is really one of the most important programs we support here at the American Academy in Rome. As most of, or maybe by now all of you know, I'm Elizabeth Rodini. I'm the Andrew High School Arts Director here. And with my colleague, Lynn Lancaster, I trade off the honor of hosting these events, which is typically a way of putting a scholar and an artist together to share their work. And our format tonight will be the same as last week. I'm going to introduce both of our speakers at the beginning. Each will have 25 minutes to speak, and we will take questions for both at the end after the second presentation. You can have questions to either or both, should the synchronicities move you that way. And there are several ways to ask a question. You can type it into the chat for me to read, or you can use the chat to indicate that you have a question and I can call on you, or you can try to raise a virtual hand and we can work that way. We're still figuring out the best way to do this in Zoom. So we'll try to get through as many of you as we can, as efficiently as we can. I would ask you to make sure you stay muted during the talks. And I think Francesca may ask you to mute your camera as well, but you don't have to do that quite yet. Our first speaker is Rebecca Messbarger, who holds the Rome Prize in Renaissance and Early Modern Studies. This is a really nice place for me to start the year because I have known Rebecca for many years. And so it's really just great to be with her here in Rome. Rebecca is professor of Italian at Washington University in St. Louis and affiliate professor in 4 different departments there. Interdisciplinarity really defines her. She was co-founder and first director of WashU's Medical Humanities program, and this came out of one of her many grants, a Mellon New Directions Fellowship that she held between 2005 and 2009. Rebecca's list of publications is lengthy, so let me just point to a few books and a movie as well. She is the author of The Century of Women, Representations of Women in 18th Century Italian Public Discourse from the University of Toronto in 2002. She's co-editor of Benedict XIV and the Enlightenment, Art, Science, and Spirituality, also from Toronto in 2016. And she's the author of The Lady Anatomist, The Life and Work of Anna Morandi Manzolini from the University of Chicago in 2010. And this book has been translated into German and Italian and was a finalist for the College Art Association's Charles Rufus Maury Book Award for the best publication in art history. It was also the basis for a film, The Lady Anatomist, directed for German television by Iris Feger in 2019. I believe, Rebecca can correct me, that COVID got in the way of this project. It's been delayed perhaps, but my hope is that maybe we'll be able to view it together this spring. That would be great. And our second speaker will be Francesca Bernie, who is the NL Italian Fellow in Architecture, Urban Design, and Landscape Architecture. Francesca received her doctorate from the Politecnico di Milano in 2020 with a thesis entitled The Shapes of Water, Discourse around the Architectural Project for a Landscape Reactivation in Fujian Province, which will be published by Pearson Editore. She has also studied at the UAV in Venice and at Roma Tre, where she received her undergraduate degree in architecture. And so Francesca is a really great resource for all of us working in Rome. She also spent 9 months in Madrid as part of an Erasmus program at the Escuela Técnica Superior de Arquitectura. Francesca's work has led her not only to distant places, but to other disciplines, including theater, dance, and ceramics, which she describes as essential to her research on the relationship of the body to the space of landscape. Francesca has participated in a multitude of collaborative research projects and was part of the team that won the international competition for the restoration of the Musumeci Bridge in Potenza in 2020. Other group projects have been shown at the Politecnico di Milano and the Triennale di Milano, and she has publications in Domus Web and the International Journal of Architecture, Art, and Design. One of the most interesting parts of Francesca's training, and something we will hear more about tonight, is the time she spent at Shanghai's Jiao Tong University exploring Chinese approaches to the landscape. Francesca's talk is titled Novissimo Landscape. But we are going to begin back in Italy, in Bologna, I believe, with Rebecca and her talk, From the Gallows to the Dissection Table. Rebecca. Rebecca, I don't know if you're talking, but you may need to.
I think I just did it. Are we there? Well, first of all, thank you so much, Elizabeth. It is such a treat to be introduced by my good friend, and it's just really delightful to be able to share some of this work with you guys. I look forward to your questions. I hope you have lots of them. So this book project I'm working on examines the still disregarded influence of Illuminismo Italiano, the Italian Enlightenment movement, whose tenets, I argue, coalesced around conceptions and treatment of the human body, particularly the criminal corpse. And a foremost case in point, which some of you may be familiar with, is Cesare Beccaria's 1764 treatise, mega bestseller, De Delitti e delle Pene, on crimes and punishments, which demanded the eradication of state-sponsored torture and capital punishment, and whose influence extended from Milan to St. Petersburg, from Paris to Philadelphia. Along with Beccaria's defense of the body as core to individual subjectivity and inviolable rights, which is something I confront in the second part of my book, I explore more generally in each of the book's 4 sections the ways in which the gallows influenced dominant cultural, religious, aesthetic, political, and medico-scientific reforms. So the 4 cultural capitals are the settings for my analysis, and they're Bologna, where we're going to go today. And Bologna was a papal state. Then we moved to Milan, ruled by the Austrian Habsburgs, and to Florence, which a very idealistic 18-year-old Grand Duke Peter Leopold used to create really a model Enlightenment city-state. And finally, Naples, which was ruled by the Spanish Bourbons, and that saw the foundation of a revolutionary republic, but that ended very abruptly and very violently with the execution in Piazza del Mercato of all of the leaders of this republic. So while each capital had a discrete cultural history and mode of governance, the human body, in particular, the criminal body, was a recurrent touchstone for transformation. So what I'm going to do today is provide hopefully a preview of the first part of this study that's set in Bologna. And so we're going to go to Bologna at the dawn of the Enlightenment. As many of you know, major cities and universities all have nicknames in Italy. We have La Sapienza here in Rome. Bologna's university was known as Madre degli Studi, the mother of learning, because it was the oldest and among the most venerable universities in Europe. Dante and Petrarch studied here. And from the 14th century, it cultivated and hosted numerous modernizers of medical science. Among these, and I'm going to forward, was Mondino de Luzzi. And you see on here the frontispiece of Johannes Kettem's Fasciculus, but this image is associated with Mondino de Luzzi's most important practical anatomy text of the Middle Ages, Anatomia, that was published in 1316, and whose motto was videre ad sensum, understanding through practice. So Mondino de Luzzi in Bologna really restarted the study of anatomy through his public dissections and the publication of this book. On the right, you see the portrait image of Andreas Vesalius, the great anatomist, the great Renaissance anatomist. And he did the dissection of 3 executed criminals in Bologna in 1540 that became really a basis, one basis for his grand anatomical atlas, De Humani Corporis Fabrica, that was published in 1543, and whose mantra was, cut with your hands, see with your eyes, the truths revealed by dissection. So Bologna was the second city after Rome of the Holy See. It was governed jointly by a gonfaloniere, a mayor, whose term lasted all of 2 months, and by the more stable legislator or administrator, the cardinal legate, who was the Pope's direct representative on the ground. So religion and science, religion and medicine were deeply entwined in the culture of the university and the city. And by the late 17th century, however, Counter-Reformation strictures severely regulated not only what could be taught and by whom, but how it could be taught, specifically scientific material. It was at this time that a strict theoretical approach of approved texts only was imposed. And you know, my friend, the historian Marta Cavazza, has linked these new strictures to the condemnation of Galileo and its aftermath. But this repression had a really profound effect on experimental philosophy and practical anatomy, including human dissection. Largely, all of this moved outside of public view and went inside the private homes of professors. So this is one of my favorite quotes at the start to describe what was happening at the start of the 18th century. The start of the 18th century, because of these strictures, Bologna is in the throes of a cultural and economic decline. Its international students, the very lifeblood of the city, have departed for hubs that are more hospitable to experimental philosophy. And so the Archdeacon of Bologna, Anton Felice Marsili, who was part of an outward-looking group of academicians who were lamenting this state, said, "Let the wound be uncovered. Let the agonizing catastrophe emerge. One searches Bologna in vain for Bologna. The rostrums are empty, the students disappear, the teachers mute." And it would be that very archdeacon's brother who would bring about the cure for this cultural ill and spur a renewal of academic culture with his founding in 1714 of the Institute of Sciences. And you see, this is Luigi Ferdinando Marsili, the archdeacon's brother, and this is a print of the Institute of Sciences. And the aim, according to Marsili, was to render Bologna equal to the major universities and academies of France, England, Germany, and Holland. So what happened? This institute became a kind of shadow university. It was independent from the University of Bologna, and rather than a theoretical methodology, it prescribed an experimental method. It was outfitted with state-of-the-art at the time laboratories with the best scientific instruments. And its core disciplines were decidedly STEM. They were chemistry, physics, astronomy, math, natural history, botany, and military science. But truly, what revitalized Bologna and was studied in this institute was medicine, modern medicine, and anatomy. And these subjects would end up dominating Bologna's institutional and cultural renewal for the next half century. So the most important patron of the Institute of Sciences and of Bologna's resurgence as a center of anatomical and medical innovation would be this man, native son Prospero Lambertini, who would become Archbishop of Bologna in 1731, where he would remain until 1740, when he was elected, rose to St. Peter's throne, elected Pope Benedict XIV. He was a very, very, very devout, passionate Bolognese. And he really wanted to refurbish his city. Immediately upon his return to Bologna, he undertook several truly remarkable initiatives to elevate Bologna as a European center of modern anatomy and medicine. But before I talk about these innovations, I'd like to consider who was this man? Art historian, who I believe studied here, Christopher Johns, has called him a moderately modern pope. And I think that's apt. He was a correspondent of Voltaire's, and Voltaire dedicated a play to him. And at the same time, at the end of his papacy, he put Voltaire on the index. So Lambertini lived from the 17th century to the 18th century. He straddled that divide, but more importantly, he straddled the cultural and epistemological divide of the Counter-Reformation and the burgeoning Enlightenment. As Pope, he was unbending on questions of doctrine, pastoral duty, and infallible church authority. At the same time, however, he elevated empirical science and medicine as a means of fostering a more rational faith, what he called devozione regolata, of practically enhancing the common good, about he was deeply concerned, and crucially of advancing the worldly stature of the Catholic Church that was under siege by Protestant and secular revolt in the 18th century. So why medicine? Well, medical knowledge was this sphere of education and practice that he relentlessly promoted because it undergirded his own performance of his high church office as promoter of the faith, otherwise known as the devil's advocate, an office that he had held for 20 years before coming to Bologna. And as devil's advocate, he had, over the course of those 20 years, challenged countless claims to sanctity and miracles. And he had done this on the basis of his truly extraordinary medical erudition. He had gained expertise from longtime collaborations with a corps of Roman and Bolognese physicians, and by studying a vast canon of ancient to modern medical literature. The culmination of his work as promoter of the faith and of his investment in medicine was this monumental 4-volume doctrinal tract on the beatification and canonization of the blessed and servants of God. This is the book on canonization beatification procedures that actually is still used today. So in this nearly 500-page section of just volume 4, this is just a massive work, he dedicates his study to miracles. And in this section, these 500 pages dedicated to miracles, Lambertini systematized the criteria for evaluating miraculous evidence in canonization procedures. He cataloged the signs, symptoms, and possibilities for cure of an array of physical and mental maladies. I don't need to say this, but I will just say this, if you think of your run-of-the-mill miracle, it is a bodily event. The blind see, the deaf hear, the mute speak, the lame walk, the dead rise. And that's exactly what he was focused on. He looked at maladies such as blindness, deafness, mutism, paralysis, epilepsy, hydrophobia, dropsy, wounds, cancer, diabolical possession. But he was really interested in modern medical therapies. He talks about biomechanics. He's sort of obsessively interested in this burgeoning field of brain science, in cardiology. He was deeply interested in the reproductive body and in really documenting questions of sexual difference. But his ultimate aim in this major portion of his work was to meticulously delimit structures and functions of the natural body in order to identify what was outside of nature, and therefore valid evidence of miraculous healing. He cites more than 100 medical masters, far more than church fathers, and they were Catholic and non-Catholic alike, but he privileged his own direct experience evaluating the evidence as promoter of the faith, challenging claims to sanctity and miracles. His discussion is remarkably modern. He points to the displacement of outmoded theories with new theories and more exacting medical knowledge that reveal the errors of past judgment. He's rigorously skeptical in his forensic approach, and he is witheringly scornful of superstition. To give just one example, in the section devoted to resurrection miracles, he explains to his readers, and I'm quoting, "With corpses, many things may be observed that create not only the suspicion of a miracle, but certitude in the ignorant rabble, when in fact none surpasses the power of nature. Corpses sometimes move, they blush, they are soiled, they are sprinkled with ruddy stigmata, they remain warm for a great length of time, and their nails, hair, and teeth are said to grow." And then he talks about a case on which he worked. The corpse of Gualtiero Bustacchio, decapitated by the executioner in Florence, was being carried to the church of Santa Croce to be buried, when it was suddenly and spontaneously disturbed by so powerful a convulsion that the boards carrying it burst apart and the body nearly detached itself from the shoulders of those bearing it. He explains, "This persisted until it was finally shot by an arrow." He concludes, however, that of course this wasn't a diabolical resurrection as the superstitious mob believed, but rather, and I'm quoting, "the clumsy spasms of living breath hiding and flickering in the recesses of the entrails." He is intolerant of superstition, and something that I'm going to work on in this section of the book, he is also really suspicious and denigrating of extreme asceticism, miraculous deprivations of mystical bodies, specifically visionary women. And I will come back to that. So Lambertini's deep practical and intellectual engagement with medical science would lead him to elevate the collaboration between church and science beyond anything that had come before during the Counter-Reformation, and indeed exceed the context of saint-making itself. So I want to go back to those innovations that he undertook in Bologna to give you some examples. So the year that he arrived, he conceived of the first monumental anatomy museum on the Italian peninsula. And he wanted it to be the rival of anything else in Europe. It was housed in the Institute of Sciences, and it was going to be the counterpart to the dissection, the annual dissection of a criminal corpse in the University Anatomy Theater that took place during Carnival. The museum wouldn't be realized while he was Archbishop. He had to wait till he was Pope, and he could take advantage of all the funds in the Vatican's coffers to pay for this monumental project. But it was used to teach anatomy, and even more importantly, it was used to showcase that Bologna was back as a center of medical science. The other spectacle, really, that he orchestrated was the awarding of the first degree, university degree, to a woman at the University of Bologna, which took place in 1732. And the woman who received the award was a natural philosopher and expert in Newtonian optics, Laura Bassi. And the Pope, he wasn't Pope at the time, he was still Archbishop. But one of the things that he did, he required that she be the lecturer at the annual public anatomy lesson in the Archigymnasium. And if you look at this picture, you can see that there's a woman in black with her arm raised. And that is Laura Bassi lecturing alongside the dismembered corpse. Lambertini promoted other scientific women. And this promotion of the institutional authority of scientific women like Bassi, and later the anatomist Anna Morandi Manzolini, was unique in Europe at the time. And it was intended as a singular sign not only of Bologna's ascendancy as a center of modern inquiry and social progress, but of a modernizing Catholic Church. And so one of the things that has not been done, and I hope to do in this part of the book, is to show that Benedict's promotion of scientific women was the other side of the coin from his suspicion and disapproval of women mystics. Several other acts that he undertook as Pope now to modernize medicine. He established the first school of surgery within the Institute of Sciences and appointed the first chair, Pier Paolo Molinelli, and gave him top-notch surgical instruments. And he also established the first school of obstetrics, also in the Institute. And this was to teach midwives, along with surgeons, proper techniques in infant delivery. And he outfitted this school with 200 models, like you see here, of the gravid uterus with fetus in different modes of presentation. He focused, I think it's important to note, on those medical arts that were seen forever as sort of lower manual labor, anatomy, obstetrics, surgery, and he elevated them because he knew that that was really the way to benefit the populace, that those are where the high mortality lay. And so this was really important to him to see to the common good. But in this chapter, this section of the book, the thing that I really am going to focus on is Archbishop Lambertini's notification of 1737. He put out this notification to all the pastors of Bologna, compelling them to make their parishioners give up the bodies of their dead kin for the bene publico, the public good of dissection in the university public anatomy, this annual anatomy. And I'm just going to read what he said. The clergy will take every measure to secure the consent of relatives for this useful work, reminding them not what theologians and canonists have written, but rather doctors themselves. Scholars have underestimated the significance of this mandate, which I believe marks a cultural sea change. With this notification, Lambertini radically revises the ancient ars moriendi, the art of death symbolism of the public anatomy, which had served as a post-mortem humiliation and punishment on a criminal body in order to restore the moral order. He wipes that away, and he effectively ushers in the modern practice of body donation. So the major questions that I'm hoping to ask in this portion of the book is, what is the bene publico? What is the bene comune that enlighteners in Italy are talking about, and specifically Benedetto XIV? I'm seeking to determine what public, who's good, especially in the context of the gallows. I also hope to complicate understanding of the role and representation of different bodies in different spaces. on the dissection table, hanging from the gallows, but also inside churches, at the podium of academies, etc. But the most important question I hope to confront, and this may seem strange, and I would love to hear your feedback, is not what was gained by Benedict's reforms and promotion of medical science, but what was lost with the demystification, the desacralization of holy bodies on the altar of the dissection table. So I'm going to leave it there, and I hope I stayed inside my time. Thank you.
Thanks, Rebecca. Perfect. You had a minute to spare. Francesca. Francesca's asked us again if we would mute our cameras. I think she's going to show some video and thinks that might help our connection. So.
So here we are. Thank you, Elizabeth, for the presentation, and thanks for the opportunity to talk about Novissimo Landscape. And then, hi everybody. I'm delighted to show you the project Novissimo Landscape tonight, while the Academy's experience starts. I'm curious to see the outcome at the end of April, also after the live and community exchanges. Let's start with explaining the expression Novissimo Landscape. The Latin word novissimo comes from the exhibition titled Strada Novissima, curated by Paolo Portoghesi for the first architectural biennale in Venice in 1980. For that occasion, an artificial road was displayed into the long space of the Arsenale Corderie with a sequence of urban facades reproducing an outdoor space into an indoor one. It is a cinematographic operation that underscores the perpetual artificial condition in which the human being is. With a remix of modern facades that are supposed to be outdoor, Paolo Portoghesi created a forever new road, let's say. Indeed, the expression novissimo can be translated with super new, to express the ever-renovated and ever-present condition in which landscape can be felt and crossed. The expression wants to point out that landscape is not something already given or solved. Still, every time it needs to be rediscussed and rewrote, depending on the time and space we are immersed in. Indeed, what informs the investigation is not the landscape itself, but tools, supports, and media that allow the landscape to be again. What I'm doing is I'm moving the spotlights from objects to relational space, from space meant as a void to space as the dense matter we are immersed in. Indeed, the movement of our body has an essential role in my research. I developed its meaning into the landscape as a project environment. Thanks to the Chinese architectural and landscape culture studies, I look at design techniques and philosophies with a renovated glance, combining my Western education with the Chinese experience. And here I want to quote Nietzsche, the philosopher, whose words are very close to Chinese thought about the landscape. Nietzsche says, when we go wandering in the loggias and gardens, it is we who want to have translated into stone and plant. It is in ourselves that we want to walk. This distance between what we are, and where we feel or desire to be is where the landscape manifests. But how and why we are all immersed in the landscape, and how and why we are landscape. Here you can see a short list for guiding you into the presentation. The following two slides contain one video each. They show the book I made for my PhD thesis dissertation, and then a brief excerpt of a more long video about the Chinese context I work into. They tell the earlier research issues about the Chinese notion of landscape. whose Chinese expression is Shen Shui, and why and how that work is the basement for the Academy's project. Finally, the second part is dedicated to Novissimo Landscape in Rome, and I will show you the drawings I applied with, explaining the purposes and goals of the project. The shapes of water. Discourse around the architectural project for a landscape reactivation in Fujian province is the full title of my PhD work. Here, the book made for the defense. The thesis right now is an ongoing publication with Parson Editions, as Elizabeth already said. And with this video, I would like to take you quickly along the eastern path, which guided me to Novissimo Landscape. From the beginning, the goal was to make a book structure to be consulted as a box. In fact, each section has an individual autonomy, while subtly contains the conclusions that are then distributed throughout the war research. The book, thought of as a design space, is a project tool itself. It is dedicated to fragile and compromised contexts. And this fragility is related to the landscape and the spatial consequences that our living has in the context. So the landscape is fragile, as the project is. Still, this fragility endows their shared environment with a valuable potential that invites us to act, be, and design. The research The Shapes of Water is a tool, a primary source to draw on, to operate within compromised contexts whose right functioning has been interrupted or damaged, preventing the possibility of being of the landscape. The research purpose is to delineate the ages of the architectural project's action for the landscape's reactivation, demonstrating that the latter is the project's and living's environment. Indeed, this point is part of my investigation even in a broader terms. Let's say, what is the project's environment? This is the starting question, and the thesis pretends to demonstrate that the landscape is the project's environment, and in this sense, they can be the same. This shift of meaning allows us to bring back the premises and purposes of any modification to the architectural project's contextual reasons, especially to the actions and processes that formulated it. If the project is space, then the project is landscape. The investigation doesn't provide solutions, but clearly defines where it is urgent to start to re-establish the landscape's possibility. It defines the field of action as a carpet. What are the spatial operations necessary to re-establish the spatial conditions for the landscape? Hence, water is an instrument, support, material, and development field of the research, in theoretical and practical terms. As I said before, this video is an excerpt of a longer one, about 15 minutes of recording. It is an original material that has not been used for the thesis defense, for instance, nor published yet. Still, even if they don't appear in the final result, the videos were among the primary media used to understand connections and consequences between punctual phenomena and general geographical structure. Moreover, the video underscores the ritual space's essential role, which water perfectly expresses, pointing out the strong influence upon the landscape and space transformation. 6 abandoned and semi-abandoned buildings built during the Republic of China at the beginning of the 20th century are the investigation object. Still, they are immersed in a network of canals grafting the village into a much larger system. Their state of degradation and abandonment is linked to water circulation and the lexicon loss necessary to inhabit rural territories using water. They are also embedded in a broader geographic history that involves water and illuminates a neglected past about early shapes of globalization during the decline of European imperialism in its encounter with China. Moreover, in China, the water founds settlement systems, and literally it is urban and domestic space in space and time continuity that has meant and still means space, time, and landscape. The impact of the question of water on the abandonment of 6 small villas in a tiny village in Fujian is a problem linked to the relationship between city and countryside, to the continuous and increasingly rapid migration between metropolitan centers and small towns, to the construction of large infrastructures and the loss of meaning of practices with respect to the space in which they are placed. Then water is the thermometer that measures all these phenomena. The state of degradation and abandonment of space and buildings are the tangible consequences of the landscape health. We are all immersed in the landscape. The architectural project can focalize the depth and complexity of the phenomena that degrade and consume the places and understand possible ways to rebuild a temporal sense of space. Our body is the first support to cross the time of space and make space itself possible. Everyone can be landscape. Indeed, we are the only species that can make the landscape appear, the only species without which landscape would not exist. This aspect almost shakes us because, on the one hand, it suddenly invests us, and on the other hand, it shifts our center of gravity into a much larger wall. As well as an ecological issue, being in the landscape is also a work in the depths of ourselves as mankind. We are not just pushed to shift ourselves from the center to the side, but even move our perception system from the eyes to the body, from nature as a mirror to nature as an environment. One of the research goals is to resonate with the European visual culture and the Chinese immersive one, set up staging this relationship through the landscape into the room. And finally, we go through Novissimo Landscape in Rome and the drawings I applied with to explain the project proposal. These are the first drawing and notes I made to chase the main concepts, and I even jumped some ladders for catching and fixing the idea. The drawing with the three axes X, Y, and Z reveals the room as a metaphor. Indeed, the room doesn't represent itself, but the measure we need to apply to give sense to space and time. When I say, I will bring the landscape into the room, before the room itself, I refer to the action of measuring. For measure, I mean the abstraction that mankind apply to the world for understanding and dwelling it. It's also a question of language and communication. The attempt to connect time and space in a coherent system of relations is how we grow our awareness about the fragility and temporary state of things, besides communicate, translate, and transmit. In this sense, Rome reveals both the bright and dark side of space. The Baroque finds its natural environment. The ground is an intertwined stratification of past, present, and future, a sort of expanded archaeology. Moreover, Rome is probably one of the few metropolises where the parks can bring us from the core of the city to the outside. For all these reasons, Rome is the perfect city where experiment the first application of Novissimo Landscape project. But where exactly does the idea of the room come from? Indeed, there is a story that was illuminating for me, and not for chance, I guess, it belongs to the Chinese culture. Zhang Bing was a Chinese painter and writer living between the 375 and the 443. He was among the first to define the landscape, spending most of his life walking into the mountains of southwest China. When he reached old age, Zhang Bing decided to retire to Jiangling, his hometown. Painting from only the memory he had of the landscapes he had crossed, he played his lute surrounded by his paintings. And in this room, both real and metaphorical, the literate reconstructed the landscape in an interior. The landscape passes through the body, the physicality of the landscape experience. It is immersion in physical and abstract space, both external and internal. The research crosses the space of dialogue between the European notion of landscape and the Chinese notion of shen shui, water mountain. That means landscape in Chinese. Then, which are the materials, tools, and actions to exhibit the landscape into the room? The Appia Antica Regional Park and the room are the two fields where the landscape's experience takes place. A geometrical surface intercepts the fragments of the continuous flowing landscape. The sections of the territory are the surfaces where the landscape shapes are impressed. Then, while following the traces of this ideal plan, I will collect impressions by going across the landscape. Then, back in the studio, I will transform the impressions in drawings on fabric, expressing the ephemeral and the ethereal dimension of the landscape. The ideal plan of this section becomes a cloth shaped in the space of the exhibition. Then the context of the park is linked to its cartography and the sections that gather from it. And simultaneously, the room's volume is connected to the big and long fabrics to set up into the studio's inner space. Crossing the nature of the large park is the moment of the impression of the landscape, let's say, while the metaphorical space of the small room is the place for the expression of the landscape. During these crossings, these impressions are brought back into the residence, into the studio, and the fabric is the support meant to express the changing forms of the Roman landscape. Then, as Zhang Bing, the geometric plane of the fabric is drawn via abstraction processes, remembering the journeys through the metropolitan nature of Rome in this case. The abstraction of the landscape elements, as well as the softness of the fabrics, set up the environment, expresses the sedimentation and stratification of time through space. Then, crossing the room is like crossing a landscape, submerging and emerging once again. And as you can see in the middle images, thanks to the addition of the human figures, these drawings underscore the room's metaphorical role in measuring the space to express it. And with this sample of a landscape shapes glossary, the core of Novissimo Landscape is cross, perhaps. The couples are made by the natural element and its abstraction. It probably reveals the research engine that is the entangled life of visible and invisible that shapes space. That is the landscape, after all, something invisible which shapes the visible world and that can be expressed and felt by mankind only. The park's natural context shapes will undergo an abstraction brought by the gestures movement for representing them in their formal fugacity and body intangibility. I'm actually going back to what I said with the introduction. Shape of the space and the landscape are not something given or already done. Still, they are in a state of perpetual transformation, and their spatial identity depends on movement and perception rather than on size and disposition. Then the movement in space is linked not just to the excursions into the park, but also the signs to draw and impress onto fabrics to express the state of perpetual transformation of the landscape. Then also the architectural project is not something given or complete, but always needs to be rediscussed and rewrite. The body's movement represents thinking in space indeed, and the fabrics are the best support to express the complexity, stratification, and landscape depth. Moreover, the fabrics question the room's volume, shaping the void as a dense matter, supporting the coincidence between landscape and project. Crossing space is design, and architecture feeds on the landscape. Then finally, I want to end this presentation saying again that exchange moments are equally important. And I want to repeat that the proposed idea lends itself to being an open and inclusive project, and the collective itineraries could be moments of sharing and common experience. So I would like to say again that it would be very nice to cross the open Roman landscape together during next month. Thank you.
Thank you, Francesca. You two were model speakers in many ways, not least for the timekeeping, many ways. And we are now open for questions. We have a good amount of time for conversation and discussion. I think it's interesting. Last week we had two papers that were so tightly intertwined, and this time we have two things that are rather distinct, although I know that this group can probably also make connections between them. But I wanted to know, you can put a question in the chat, you can raise a hand. Would anyone like to start? Or Lynn?
Oh, no, let him go first.
Avinon.
Lynn, go ahead, please.
No, I was just wondering, with the last one, with Francesca, have you developed a plan yet for walking across the landscape, and like what areas you want to go to? You mentioned the Via Appia, but I just wonder how you plan to start your project.
Yeah, I prepare a cartography and I will start with the first walk as soon as possible, starting to go more in depth in the direction of the outside part of the city. For now, I just prepared the cartography, the base, and I'm waiting to print it and to have in my hands and start to draw in an open air dimension. So I'm looking forward to starting matching the cartographic dimension and then the map that I prepared together with the excursions and itineraries. For now, I think to start from the inner part of the Appia Antica Regional Park, that is in the inner part of the city. But of course, during next weeks, I can even start from the very outside part of the park and then even of the city. Novissimo Landscape is a project that try to place in a relation of resonance, preparation of materials and supports together with improvisations in space.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I?
Avinoam, please.
Thank you.
Start.
You know, I'm trying always to find connection between talks, so maybe I'm too creative now. But what I want to say that I felt that one can create something, a kind of a link between the two talks, and it will take us into the keyword would be the public body. And I think that I'm going now to Rebecca, and I would first ask Rebecca to comment on that, and then I will go back to Francesca and ask her about it as well. Because what I felt with Rebecca, there is something very interesting about the freedom that one takes at that time on making the body to be a public body. It is the criminal body, as if the criminal body is part of a bulk of body in the society that we can make it public, as if other body will be kept, you know, intimate and secure, and the criminal body would be part of a public view in the dissection, in the hanging as well. And I'm coming here to a work that of my colleague Meredith Gamer, who work also on the combination between the criminal body and public view, where she is looking at the execution of the body of the criminal on one hand, up to the criminal being used in studio for modeling. So you have the same idea. You are talking about dissection, but it's the criminal body as well. So the question is, how can we, what is the ethic of taking the body and making it public if we are dealing mainly with criminal in that moment? And I thought that the public body is also in Francesca, because Francesca started with some citation from Nietzsche, talking about we becoming a stone, we becoming maybe a plant while walking in nature. So in a way, the nature is a kind of a public body. And I wonder if you should not be more careful when you speak about landscape as opposed to nature, because all the spaces that you have shown are landscape. They are land that have been scaped by human bodies. So that's why the Chinese people can walk in this landscape. If it was not scape, I wonder if we could walk in this wildness of nature. So you are dealing with landscape, but I think that sometimes you regard it as a nature, not as a landscape, in a kind of a idealization of nature vis-a-vis nature, vis-a-vis human-made space. But it was very interesting to see, and I think it's interesting to think at it as a kind of a public space and a public, the landscape as a public space for a body that could immerse into it and become then manifested in the landscape itself. The best example is, of course, to think about it is the Central Park in New York as a kind of a reservoir of landscape within the urban space. But you can also walk here in the city of Rome and see the wild plants starting to, to grow through the asphalt as a kind of creating a kind of a landscape within an urban space as well, and the immersion of the body. I don't know if I'm clear here, but I'm trying to pull together the public body into landscape and the public body and the criminal. I'm not able to put the criminal into the landscape again, but back to you.
I think
So
it's
maybe
great.
Rebecca, if you want to
Yeah.
add something, or
Yeah,
Francesca, I'll be happy to hear.
I love that question. I love the chain of questions that you've sort of thrown out here, because the whole question of publicity, especially in the context of the 18th century, and I think that when so many bodies that have been marginalized are allowed to enter the public sphere, and that is why I think it is so remarkable that this Pope advocates the publicity of the naked and the extra naked, the dissected body, as a public good, because there's been a lot of scholarship on the fact that autopsy, which is a private affair, had no negative connotations. I mean, dissection itself was not a negative thing, but when it's put on a marble slab for everyone to see, when the cadaver is out there, it has that publicity, that lack of privacy, that lack of control. It just has endless negative connotations of iniquity, of sinfulness and criminality, and you have the opposition of Vesalius's dissection of a female cadaver, which even heightens that scene further. So I think that those are really good questions. The personal, when it's personal, right? So you can have the representation of the anatomical body, which is depersonalized, but then when it's when you're casting from a guy who was just taken off the Tyburn gallows, that's a whole nother affair. It just perpetuates the punishment for eternity, in a sense, as long as that body is in the public space. So yeah, I mean, for me, what's really interesting is the fact that this guy, who's the leader of the Catholic Church, puts women's bodies in the public sphere, in institutional positions, and cadavers in the public sphere as a good, as a public good, as a signal of modernity. So But, you know, and just to stop talking, we today, obviously, the display of human remains is a highly problematic issue. And there are all kinds of rules that govern this. And so this is a relatively new idea, right? The privacy that must be attached to the display of the dead body. But it is relatively new.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, we
Yeah.
saw many relics. We saw many relics before with human particles being on display. Yeah.
We just went, Audrey and I just went to see Sant'Agnese's little tiny skull, little 13-year-old baby skull. Yeah, no, lots of relics to see here.
I'm just going to interject because we have a couple of questions that I think piggyback nicely on Avinoam's question. So I just wanted to, for Francesca, this question of the landscape and nature, or as differentiated from nature. We had a couple of questions that link to that and to the idea of body. So if you don't mind, I'm going to try and combine them and maybe you can address them all at once. One is from Alex Kleeman, who asks about landscape as a shared social construction and to what degree it's subjective, a product of the fit between an individual body and the contours of the terrain. So a similar kind of idea that the space is always being remade according to who's moving through it, I think sort of partners with some of the things Avinoam was asking. And also then Robert Pietrusco asked about sort of, as you yourself move through these landscapes, if you'll be sort of thinking about the intentional constructions of those spaces and kind of guiding your walking intentionally around that constructed landscape, or how much there'll be sort of an intuitive interaction with the space. So again, it's sort of about how an individual body moves through these spaces and remakes them. So I hope that didn't overly complicate the question, but it gives you a few different ways of thinking about this issue of the, I would say the subjectivity of.
Okay, you are muted, Elizabeth. The question is?
The question is really about the subjectivity of this
okay. So,
landscape, I think, and if you could say more about individual bodies within that landscape.
Yeah. It jumped the line. So this is one of the goal of the research, to place in a position of resonance the subjective dimension with an objective one, the cartographic dimension, and then control and writing and drawn and wrote during the itineraries, together with then a georeferential work on the cartography, and then that is, I mean, a kind of survey where the body that cross that specific landscape, and for a body, I would like to say that I don't mean just my body, but a body even like and here I mentioned the public body that Avinoam Shalem has mentioned, even as a collective, even as a community of persons, a body made by different bodies that cross the landscape. And then to coordinate the work with the abstractions of the natural elements that are going to be collected during the itineraries, and that belongs to not just subjective, but even punctual and specific condition. That is to say that landscape is the same of the project, is like the architectural project, because every time is the attempt to coordinate the objective dimension of the cartography, of the measure, together with the subjective dimension. That is the specific conditions in which that landscape appears, that landscape function, and that landscape is. And here I want to quickly just not to answer, but to give a reference that I didn't specify during the presentation for a time reason, but the expression shan shui, that means mountain water in Chinese, open up to our culture a very different way to mean the space and the space modification, because it's not, it doesn't express a fragment of a wall, landscape, but shan shui, mountain water, expresses a relational state. And then the space is relational and is linked to a motion relation between something that is vertical, the mountain, and something that is horizontal, the water, something that is very liquid with something that is very dense and material. So I think that this difference influence even the way to look at the relation between artifice and nature. For example, in the Chinese culture, the difference between artifice and nature doesn't exist. There is no word for express it. So this aspect enlightened the question of the body and the public space and the urban space, even the natural space, with a different light from our point of view.
Thank you. I think actually that artificial and natural is another way where your talks come together. You know, sort of the body as a natural thing that rots, and then a study that is a body that is made into, you know, something to be viewed and then something to be preserved. And so that's a kind of interesting connection. I wanted to ask a question of Rebecca, and feel free to put more questions in the chat. We do have some more time. I wondered, I couldn't help thinking, you know, actually Avinoam said something I thought really provocative the other day to me, which was, you know, one of the dialogues that we have between artists and scholars is artists gaining here at the Academy some historical grounding on what they do, and scholars thinking about the present. And I wondered about thinking about some of the things you said about disagreements over science and faith and facts and, you know, observation and what we think we know. I mean, as you do this work, are you thinking about the present moment? You must all the time. You're a scholar of the history of medicine in many ways, so this is, you're sort of living what you study. But I'm wondering if you have thoughts on this present moment and debates over belief and verifiability as you think about your work, and kind of voices of authority and control, and really science is sort of a political act too, right? I mean, that's claiming a kind of scientific authority.
I just finished writing this piece on saint making during the Counter-Reformation, and, you know, the sort of the exploitation, and Benedict does this as well. I mean, he's carrying this forward, and it's kind of a culmination of the Counter-Reformation project, you know, to marry science and miracles, which seems perhaps completely contradictory, but to give authority to the miracle, validity to the miracle through science, by making it scientific, the science of sanctity, you know, and yeah, I think there's probably all kinds of implications for that. Although, you know, right now, there seems to be a complete abandonment by some political factions of you know, the validity of science, period, right? That is just, that's all a hoax. This is going in the opposite direction, I think, you know. It's legitimizing things that are absolutely not palpable and beyond nature through forensic science. So yeah, it's really kind of a remarkable thing. I did notice that Lindsay in the chat had a question, and Elizabeth, do you care if I just answer that?
No, please do. I accidentally skipped over that, so I was going to
Lindsay,
go back. So please do. Why doesn't Lindsay? Yeah, please.
You want to just ask it?
Sure. Can you hear me? Okay. So you ended your talk with this idea of you wanted to develop a working thesis on what's lost. And earlier in the talk, you had mentioned that miracles are bodily. So my question was, if miracles are bodily, largely speaking, what happens when the body is increasingly demiracleized, if you will, by this process? Like, where do the miracles go?
Well, the miracles don't, I mean, it's divine intervention. So where do they come from? Kind of, but my point in this whole idea of what is lost when you demystify and desacralize the body, and when you really do kind of a microscopic analysis of the miraculous, you know, there's some great scholarship. Adriano Prosperi wrote this wonderful book on the execution of an infanticide that is where I'm going to begin this chapter. And one of the things that Catherine Park and he talk about is the execution, the public execution, is when it's done right. If fece bona morte, if somebody dies well, that criminal execution becomes a kind of martyrdom with penitence. There is this opportunity, in a sense, to become a saint in the moment of your criminal execution, and that the public dissection of the cadaver is a kind of move towards saint making. It is a reconciliation. The body is buried, you know, with a Christian burial, and there is a kind of coming back into the fold. And if bodies are just bodies, and there is no opportunity for that reconciliation and that kind of sanctification and this sort of, you know, martyrdom moment, do you lose something? I guess that's one of the questions. I mean, you know, I would prefer not execution. That's my personal preference. But I do think that there is something, I don't know, I'm grappling with this. So I'm struggling with this, and you know, that's going to be something that I really look at.
Thanks, Rebecca. We have another sort of pair of questions for you, and then maybe we can turn to one more for Francesca at least. Danny, would you like to ask your question, and maybe you could pair Rebecca's with yours, just as the...
Oh,
I think that was another Danny Smith.
It's Dylan as Danny. We had issues.
Sorry, why are you mad? There are 3 Danny Smiths on the screen. So Dylan,
Hello.
Danny Smith, how about asking your question?
My interest in what you talked about, really, I guess your talk actually sparked my interest in the ways implicit biases shape how knowledge and discourses are produced in the contemporary era. So you can think about how drug trials tend to be biased towards especially white men. Things are formulated for particular bodies, and knowledge is produced on the basis of the assumptions that come out of scientific endeavor that is maybe not so empirical, but also subjective or tinged by this. So I was wondering the ways in which both knowledge about the sort of the rational world and the knowledge of faith and how these things are tied together is shaped by the types of bodies that are dissected and put on display. I think this is basically a demographics question. How is that sort of shaping the kinds of outcomes?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. You know, in some ways, the shapes of the bodies that were used for dissection, they were looking for particular bodies. I mean, when Vesalius peeks out the window and sees another person on the gallows, oh, yay, they're going to have a fresh cadaver. He's really happy that it's a younger man who's in fairly good shape. I mean, they're looking for sort of, they don't want, quote unquote, abnormal anatomy for the annual public dissection, right? Because you're looking at sort of standards, right? So and then female bodies were rare because there just weren't that many criminals. The big crime was infanticide, and that would get you executed. But you don't have very many female bodies, so it was really special to have a female body. But younger and fairly good shape is what they were looking for, and these bodies were, of course, always hung because that was, you know, important. You didn't want to draw and you didn't need somebody drawn and quartered for. But you know, it's sort of later you have kind of the profiling of crime, and that isn't so much prevalent in the 18th century in the period that I'm working on, but it is definitely coming in toward Hogarth, and yeah, that is definitely coming in where you have a kind of criminal profile that is written on the body. Absolutely, yeah. And I don't know if that's what you're looking for.
Yeah,
I think, Maggie, if you really are Maggie.
I think there's only one Maggie.
You have a lovely question for Francesca. Would you like to?
Yeah, Francesca, so thank you both for these talks. Francesca, when you were talking about this concept of shan sui and Chinese, you know, the idea of how the Chinese language refers to landscape, it made me think of also the concept of the angle of totality in Chinese landscape painting, where painters are striving to paint sort of everything they know about a scene instead of just what you might see from a limited perspective, which is sort of more in the European tradition, I suppose. And I was listening to your ideas for this installation and thinking, just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how it seems like your installation might enable us to think about landscape more from this Chinese perspective of the angle of totality, and to think about how we sort of re-experience and recreate landscape. And when we're standing, you know, in a particular place on the Via Appia, we can see something in front of us, right, that might be limited. But with these questions of subjectivity, we're bringing to it our personal experiences and imaginations and backgrounds. And I just wondered if you could talk a little bit more. It was really interesting to me.
Thank you. And I think that I would like to enlighten the difference between the European traditional paintings of landscape and the Chinese one. Because if we think about the European tradition, we think about canvas, and we think about focal perspective, and let's think about even the window that belongs to the European and Western tradition as approach to the space. And let's think also to our writing structure, how we communicate. Our writing is linear, is made by addition letters, words, and sentences. And now let's move our talk to the Eastern culture, and let's think about the Chinese writing that is centered and that is relational, that is based on the quick movement of the hands to signs, and above all, that is relational. And if we think to Shan Shui, that it's not just landscape, but it's even the traditional way to represent the landscape. This representation is not a frame, it's not a cut, but is a roll onto the perspective, is not focal, but parallel. It's a parallel perspective. So this kind of shift, where is the shift? From me, the strong shift, the strong discovery for me was that this kind of approach to the space, because if we think even to the architectural space of Eastern culture, there are no windows, but there are vertical planes that run into this space, and the landscape reveals itself, and we suddenly are immersed in the landscape. And this allows us to be an active part of the landscape, because when we look at a European canvas of traditional representation of landscape, the painter wanted to bring us into the perspective that is focal. With the parallel perspective, our glance walk into this long space where the elements are displaced. So I don't want to affirm a culture, the Chinese culture, but I want to work, and here I come to the point of what I'm going to do here. I want to make a dialogue, a practical dialogue between the European culture, that is even my culture of provenience, with the Eastern one, and in this case that of the China. And then I will impress and draw the abstract shapes of the landscape, then of the nature, of the natural, of the part of the Appiantica Road, on long fabrics that hide more or less 3 meters. So the intention is that one of shape the void, and to questioning the void together with impressions and fabrics.
Thank you, Francesca.
Thank you. Thank you.
This has really been quite amazing and interesting, and I do think we need to stop because we're at about 7:30, but I'm going to steal the words of Kati in concluding, which you can all read, but I think she did a beautiful job of kind of bringing these things together, which is not necessarily the goal, but it kind of leaves us in a nice place. And she said, another connection that comes to mind in the two projects is the fusing together of the various epistemological domains that are bounded by the body, loosely something like the scientific cartographic and the subjective miraculous. She says, although as I write this, the paradigms become increasingly and interestingly muddled. So thank you, Kati. That was, I think, really quite a brilliant summation. Thank you to our speakers and to all of you for your really terrific questions. And buona serata a tutti. Thank you.
And to be continued on lunch as well. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night. Thanks, Elizabeth.
Thank you.
Thank you.